Thank you once again for being here with us on Unstoppable Mindset. Really appreciate you listening and watching wherever you happen to be. I am your host, Mike Hingson, and our guest today is Sandeep Dayal, who has an interesting story to tell. At least I think it's interesting. He's going to talk to us a lot about branding and marketing and such things. Having been in sales most all of my adult life, all of that gets fascinating to me. But I think that he'll have a lot of interesting topics and issues to provide us all with that will keep you interested as well. And if you're not, wake up, you should be. Anyway, Sandeep, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset. We're really glad you're here.
I'm so delighted to be here, Michael. Thank you for inviting me to be on your show.
Well, thank you for being here, and we'll have some fun. Tell me a little bit about maybe the early Sandeep growing up and all that to give people a little background.
Oh wow, that was a long time back. You sure you want to go into all that?
Oh, sure. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far
Yeah,
away.
there you go. There was a little Sandeep. Yeah. No, so I grew up in India, and if this were still 5 years back, I would have said half my life was in India and half my life in the United States because I came to the U.S. At age 27. But until then, I grew up there in a city called Jaipur, which is in the middle of the Thar Desert there. So there you go. You and I have something in common there. And then, I went through my engineering education. So I sort of learned all my background, you could say, is more analytic and scientific and so on from a training perspective at that time, which sort of shaped my view of the world at that point of time in terms of being more objective about things, thinking about things more logically and so forth. And then at some point, I set up my own little business there, which sort of brought me into areas that were beyond engineering, if you will, like the kinds of things you were talking about, Michael, like sales. How do you form relationships with people? How do you work with people? How do you run an organization and so on? And that got me much more interested in the management side of things versus just the engineering side of things. And I came to the United States in '87 to Yale University to do my MBA. And after I finished my MBA, I started working in the US, and I've lived in the US since then. Um, and I got more and more interested in other things, as you might imagine, particularly on consumer connections, the consumer side of things, consumer psychology, and what have you. So it's been a multiple year transition. I worked in a number of consulting companies. I worked at McKinsey. I worked at Booz, and then I started my own company, Serenti Marketing Group, which is much more focused on working with consumers, understanding their psychology, understanding their mindset, and so on, and then putting that to use in good marketing and in good branding. So it's been a long and steady journey, if you will.
It certainly has been, but you sound like you've survived it and you're doing well. And and now you're basically getting up near 60. So there you go.
There you go. Yeah. So there I am now in yeah, at a stage in my life where I enjoy more of the kinds of discussions that you and I are having right now. Because my earlier phase of life, I would say, was all about doing stuff, getting it
Hmm.
done, making money doing it, whatever, whichever way, making a career out of it and what have you. Now I'm at a point of life where I'm able to sort of sit back and reflect a little and say, hey, what was that all about? What did I really learn? And is there something there that I learned which is worth sharing with others? So that's why I really love being on shows like yours, and particularly yours, around mindsets and being unstoppable and so on, and sort of having a chance to, really see what all those things can possibly mean.
Yeah. And on top of everything else, you're an author. You've written some books. I love the title of the one that at least I know about, Branding Between the Years, and we'll have to get to that. That's kind of cute, but it makes a lot of sense also. I think people really don't. understand the whole idea of marketing as much as they should. And frankly, I don't think that people really understand sales like they should. And there
Or
are differences between the two, but there are also a lot of similarities, and they do dovetail to
yes,
to
they
things.
absolutely do. Yes.
And so I think it is something that a lot of people don't understand nearly as well as they should, and they're not necessarily um, making the
Yeah.
process work like
Yeah,
they
yeah,
could.
and I would say, Michael, that sales and marketing, they go hand in hand. I
Yeah.
wrote the book Branding Between the Years around branding specifically, but it actually, there's a whole, I could have written also a book which would have been called Branding Between the Years, but it would have been all about sales.
Hmm.
And but I there's sales is such a big topic and such so interesting and so rich that you don't want to sort of squeeze it into a book which is about branding. You know what I'm saying? So like,
Yeah, they're
while
different.
and in fact, I mentioned that very specifically in my book that look, we could do a whole discussion and a whole book about just the psychology of sales, the behavioral science behind sales, and that's very important. But that's a whole separate book. So I didn't cover it there.
It is, and people really get it wrong. They think of sales as, oh, the guy who's trying to make me buy a car and
Yeah,
things like
yeah,
that. And in one sense, at a very low level, I suppose you could say that's sales, but that's not really what sales is all about. I got into sales originally because I was working for a company, and the company was, well, it was Kurzweil Computer Products, Ray Kurzweil, the inventor and
yeah,
futurist and so on. And at the time, he was developing the reading machine for the blind. And I had been asked to join the company in 1978. And then in like um, May or June of 1979, I was called in, and I was doing human factors studies for them, but I was called in and told I was being laid off because I wasn't a revenue generator for the company, which I wasn't. And the company had too many non-revenue producing people, and I needed to um, go off and find another job unless I would be willing to go into sales. They gave me that option,
uh-huh.
which
Ah,
was a great compliment. And I said, I don't know anything about sales. And the guy who actually made this offer was the vice president of marketing for and sales for Kurzweil, which was a gentleman named Andrew Parsons, by the way, who used to work at McKinsey.
I see, I see. Wow, it's a
Anyway,
small
so
world. Yes.
So he said, we can teach you sales. We'll send you to a Dale Carnegie sales course and so on. And I was very fortunate because the group and the teachers really talked about the true nature of what sales was all about
Yeah.
and what it wasn't about. And that sales is really, a good salesperson is a teacher, is a guide, is a counselor. And in reality, I can't sell anyone anything. The customers really got to want to buy it if I do it
Mhm.
right.
Yes.
And that's what it's about. And then that came into play for me years later when again I was looking for another job, and I was debating at the time of looking for the job, and we found a company, my wife and I, that we thought would be a good company to go work for. But
Mm.
I debated about whether I say I'm blind in the cover letter, because that's always an issue. If you're blind and you say it, they
Mhm.
usually won't pay any attention to you. And if you don't blind and if you're blind and you don't say you're blind, then you'll go in for an interview and they'll just, the defenses will go up immediately.
Yeah.
And what I did is I wrote a cover letter, and part of the cover letter said, do you want to hire somebody who comes into the company and sells for 8 or 10 hours a day because it was a sales job and then goes home? Or do you want to hire somebody who truly understands sales for the science and art that it is and sells 24 hours a day as a way of life, which is what a blind person has to do just to be able to convince people to let them do stuff? And
Yeah.
and that sentence was what got me the interview and got me the job.
Wonderful. Wonderful. You've just you've just inspired me to actually talk about some some things in sales, and I do make a connection around this topic in my book in the following way. So branding, you can think of it in two parts. There's one part of branding which is around strategy, which is around what is your brand going to be positioned? How is your brand going to be positioned? What is it going to be? Its DNA? What is the brand going to be about? So those are decisions and choices you make around what your brand is going to be, which are more strategy. But then once you made those choices, your brand actually goes to market, right? And it goes to market often through what sometimes companies will call brand ambassadors. But these are all the people that are in stores. These are the sales side of the people, right? The people that are
Right.
actually, this is where the rubber meets the road. And so the brand actually goes to market through its ambassadors, who are really the salespeople, the retail people, and what have you. And they have to, their work is just so incredibly important. It's just as important as the design of the brand. And I'll give you a couple of examples because this is a topic that's close to my heart. So, for example, you think of a company like Bulgari, right, which sells this awfully expensive jewelry, right, hundreds of thousands of dollars and what have you. And you have to, even if you're selling to rich people, they still, think about these things because these things are pretty expensive. So one of the things, what they've done is that they've actually thought through that whole process of from the time that the person is walking into their store to every single moment that they are in the store, to how the purchase happens and what the post-purchase follow-up is. They've thought through all those things. And I'll give you a very small example about the kinds of things which are more behavioral science oriented, which is where we're going in this discussion. So one of the things they do is that when the salesperson is going to notice that, hey, you're a woman and you like a particular necklace, what they do is they have you're sitting in a private room, you're looking at this necklace, there's the salesperson with you, and the person will say to you that, look, or the brand ambassador, let's call them that. The brand ambassador is going to say, hey, why don't you try it on and what have you. And the woman can then go ahead, the customer can then go ahead and try the necklace on and look at it. And then the salesperson does something where that's very interesting. They say, hey, you know what? I need to just step out and take care of something. Would it be okay if I just do that for 5 minutes while you're, sitting here? So then they walk out of the room. And now you can imagine, here's the customer, the woman, she's sitting there with the necklace she's wearing, and there's no one to bother her or try to push her into the
Right.
sale or try to, she's just sitting there by herself. And every minute and every second that she's there with that necklace, it's feeling to her more and more like her own. And, in psychology, there's been a lot of research that has been done, which basically says that once people feel like something is theirs, they are less likely to part with it. They're less likely to give it up. So it could be anything. It could be, let's say it could be a pen that you own. But once you own it, you start valuing it more than if you didn't own it and it was just sitting on the shelf. And there's been just a lot of research to show that that is the case. So in this instance, what happens is it's not the single thing that drives the person to the sale, but it is one step, one small thing that they do, which pushes the person or coaxes the person to take one step more, feel like
Yeah.
that thing is their own. So that's what selling is about. It's not about, just pushing used cars and so on. So uh, really understanding the mindset and working with people, helping them get comfortable with the idea of owning your product is a critical thing that you do. In another example that I'll give you, this is from another very famous behavioral psychologist, Paco Underhill. He wrote a book about why people buy. This was several years. It was one of the books that inspired me to get into this whole area. And he used to observe how people shop in stores. And he would make little changes in the stores to help people be more likely to buy. And one of the things he observed was that when you kept items, like if you had women's sweaters and you put them on a table right in the middle of the aisle, right? So you're walking through the aisle in a store, and sometimes you'll see there's a table right there in the middle of the aisle. So you run into the table, and there are whole sweaters piled up there, and you can then, start looking at them. But he found that on one hand, you could say, hey, I'm putting it right in the middle of the traffic where you're going to be walking, so you'll have no choice but to stop and look at it. But what he found was that women would stop, they would look at those sweaters, but then they would quickly walk away. And the
Hmm.
reason that it was happening was that if they stopped in the middle of the aisle, that people would brush by them. And it would make them just feel uncomfortable. When somebody just comes in, someone that you don't know, just walking by that brushes by you, it makes you feel uncomfortable. So they would stop there, but they wouldn't stop there long enough to look and make up their minds. So he just had them move those tables to a more comfortable space where someone could not only stop, but look at those things at their leisure. And they found that the sales went up. So it's these little things that that people don't think. These are all parts of being a good brand ambassador, and it's all parts of designing the sales experience or the marketing experience for the person in such a way that they're going to be more inclined to prefer your product. So it's just I wasn't really going to talk about these things, but you brought it up, and it just brought back these things.
Another thing that comes to mind, just talking about that same thing, which is sort of unrelated in a way to exactly what you're talking about, is this. My wife was in a wheelchair her whole life and would go to many stores. And when there were blocks in the middle of aisles, like tables with sweaters and so on, she couldn't get by.
Yeah.
And places like Macy's for years just had very narrow aisles because
Yes.
they wanted to stuff as much in, which they felt was a good thing to do, except then people in wheelchairs couldn't get through. Well, Macy's eventually had to deal with that because they were sued and they lost. But
Yes.
but the reality is, I'm sure that changed to a degree in some ways how people viewed exactly where they should put products and so on. And it's a little bit of a different dimension um, than what you're talking about. But still, nevertheless,
Yeah.
it is also part of what we need to do to recognize that we've got to be inclusive in what we do for everyone.
Absolutely. I mean, it's this is where you and I are just talking about some examples here, but this is actually a whole area of science and design, right? Which is when you're a company, how exactly your products are displayed in a store, what height they're at, how they're displayed, what kind of a message that communicates to people is such an extremely it's such an important thing that we in our company in Serenity we can be doing entire studies, which are like 3 month long studies where we are just designing that whole aspect of how the product is presented in a store, um, for the consumer, for all of them to feel comfortable, for all of them to feel like this is something that they would like to own. And that whole process, like I described about every moment that you spend getting to that store, being in that store, and then after leaving that store, what is every single moment? What's your playbook for that moment? Is a key piece of what marketing, sales, behavioral science is all about.
Right. Well, the idea of sales and marketing and branding and so on is always going to be a moving target. It's a market of or a process of evolution because
Yeah.
as we learn more, as we develop more understanding of psychology and so on, we're going to change it. But I know you talk about the fact that there is the old branding techniques and there's a lot of new branding. How has branding kind of evolved over time?
Yeah, now interesting that you bring out. So let's talk about, the whole brand strategy piece, which is, how do you design brands and so on. And I think in some ways, branding is not rocket science, and in other ways it is.
Mm-hmm.
So the part that has been relatively straightforward about branding historically has been that, look, if you have a product and you're an entrepreneur, you have a product and you're going to put it to market, you start thinking about, okay, how is my product different from everybody else's products? And then once you make a list of all those things that are different, then you say, oh, okay, now which of these things are kind of important for people? And maybe I pick 3 or 4 things, and then I can talk about that. And the problem is that while all of that makes a lot of sense, what doesn't make sense is that that's not how the human brain works. So what
Mm-hmm.
happens when you make a list of things that are different about your product, it's kind of like it's kind of like the occasion where my wife gives me a list of things that I need to go and buy from the grocery store. And she may tell me only 5 things that I have to buy. And I go to the grocery store and then, I can't remember what those 5 things are. And I go there and I come back with 3 things that were on the list, two that are missing, and maybe another three things that were not on the list at all to begin with, right? So that's a very natural thing that happens, which is that human beings, our brains, are not really designed around remembering lists. So when the marketer goes and says, "My brand is about these three things," that it's this is something that's going to make your life easy. Oh, then this thing is very tasty. Well, easy, tasty. I mean, like, how am I going to remember all those things? So now, for example, in behavioral science, there's a whole theory around storylining, which is that people are going to remember your brands better if you can put a storyline around it. And the reason is that, like, if I give you a list of 10 things to remember, you're not going to remember it. So
Mm-hmm.
it becomes hard. 10 words to remember can become very hard. But at the same time, I can send you to watch, you might go to, somebody might tell you a story about a play that they saw, right? Which could be a whole 30-minute story. And you might then just be able to remember that story in all its detail because it's a story, right? Or somebody comes like you, now you're telling me about your life and how you went through, you went through the transition from your job to sales and how you were with Ray Kurzweil and so on. I've already remembered more than five things,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because you told me the thing in such a compelling way and such a story, in such a story form. And so what we are discovering scientifically is that when you tell people things in terms of stories, when you show them things in terms of patterns, um, when you do rhymes, for example, so there are certain types of things that the brain remembers better than if you just give it lists. So this whole old idea that used to exist that I'm just going to make my brand about the two or three things that I'm different about just doesn't work because people, when you tell them that those two or three things, they just don't remember it. And if they don't remember it, how are they going to buy your product? So now we are starting to take this new understanding of behavioral science and the psychology that we have from various studies that are being done about the human brain, right? There's a lot of study that's being done about the human brain from neuroscientists, from linguists, from cognitive psychologists, and so on. And all of them, if you take their knowledge and bring it together, it's giving us an understanding of how the brain actually works. And now you can use that understanding of how the brain works to start thinking better about how you do the designing around your brands, the strategy around your brand better.
And that's in large part what the whole concept of cognitive branding is all about.
That's exactly what cognitive branding is all about. The name of the book, Branding Between the Years, is really the allusion to the fact that what's between the years. Between the years is our brain, right? So at
Well,
the
for
end of the
some
day,
people, that's what's between the ears, and there are
That's
others I'm not so
there's
sure
some
about.
other
But
people that you wonder about, but
if there's anything
nevertheless,
there, yeah,
whatever is there, that really is our perception of the world.
right,
Our perception of what reality is, what the world is, who we are, everything that we think about, what the brands are. It's not the billboard out there. It's not what the store, it's not the little song jingle and all of these things. But it's when all of those different things, the touch and feel, the sound and sight, and I mean, all of these things actually are processed in your brain. And so your vision of what this thing is, what this brand is, what it's all about, is really determined. It's arbitrated between your ears, and that's why the book is called Branding
right.
Between the Ears. Yeah.
Wait, you talked before about the woman trying on the necklace and then the branding ambassador leaving, and about ownership and so on. It
Yes.
really ultimately comes down to getting people to relate to whatever it is that you're trying to get them to relate to, and getting them to feel some ownership. But more important, just feeling ways to relate. I sold a number of products that were very similar to products that other companies would produce. I sold um,
Mhm.
big tape backup storage systems that people would use to back up data on Wall Street and other places. And although we were the developers of some of the technology, Other companies would buy our technology and they would put it in their own products. And the reality is, ultimately speaking, there were not huge differences
Hmm.
directly,
Hmm.
physically. There were
Yes.
differences in shapes and so on, but they weren't really different. And so the issue is, why would one buy my product as opposed to someone else's? And that's where it
Yes.
gets back to, what is it that we're really talking about? What is it that we're really doing? Why would you buy my product as opposed to somebody else? It has a lot to do with not just, and not at all necessarily with, um, here are the differences, but rather you have to find other things that people are going to react to, that they'll perceive your product as being the one that they ought to have. And it's my job to help them see that
Yes.
in an intelligent way, while at the same time not alienating other people and making me look like just the used car sales guy.
Yes. Yes. And I think that my whole book is really about that very question, which is that why would somebody buy your brand, right? And how
Right.
do and it comes from that study of really understanding how people have bought brands and how in my company's work. So my company does a lot of work around designing brands and helping companies launch their products. And some of those brands have gone on to become some of the largest brands in the world. But really it is in fact around that whole question around the why. And what has changed is, and of course, sometimes, like I said, you can give people a set of reasons and they will, for those reasons, buy your product. But what we're finding through science is that um, what we're finding through science is that it's not the case that people always make decisions so rationally. It's not the case that people always sit down and do like a pros and cons of things, like, okay, this is product A, product B, let me do a pros and cons, let me do a spreadsheet on this, and so on. People do a lot of things very instinctively, for example. And in fact, there is research that has been done which has shown that 95% of all the choices that people make, okay, and if in your life, and in your every day, there are thousands of choices you're making all the time, and there's research that shows that 95% of those choices are done instinctively and not deliberatively, right? And
Mm-hmm.
this is science. It's called system 1 and system 2, by a very famous psychologist, who gave those terms to these forms of thinking, the instinctive and the rational thinking. The psychologist's name is uh, Daniel Kahneman, and he is at Princeton University. But it's something that you can actually, this is something that you can intuitively relate to, which is that, for example, when you're driving a car, there are a lot of choices that you're making, and those are very complex life and death choices, right? Because if you make a mistake in terms of how you drive the car, but you make choices around how fast you're going to go, how much you're going to press the accelerator, whether you're going to take a left, whether you're going to veer to the right, all of those choices you're making, and you're just doing that instinctively, almost without thinking. Many times people are singing or thinking about something else as they're driving and so on. And all of this is happening instinctively. And the reality is that even when it comes down to branding, there are many, many things that people do instinctively and make those choices instinctively. So understanding what that is and how that happens is a key part of how you can make um, brand choices. So I'll give you an example. Um, so what happens is, as we go through our lives, we have many, many different experiences. Based on those experiences, we have certain learnings. And with those learnings, and those are learnings that I would call, like, that's the wisdom that we acquire over life, as a result of the experiences that we have in our life, right? And those are our personal wisdoms. Those are things that we have decided this is how things work. So, for example, there's one common wisdom which is seen across many, many people across countries and so on, where people say, hey, the simpler answer is the better answer, right? And there's an effect around it. It's called the Occam's razor, which is
Mm-hmm.
which basically says that given a problem, and if there are two possible answers to the problem, then the simpler answer is the better answer, right? And a lot of times this comes from this kind of wisdom comes from the aspect that don't overcomplicate life, don't overthink things. The things things sometimes you can decide quickly. So what marketers have done, for example, there is there's a company called HEB, which is a grocery store in the South where they make prepared meals. And so they did a whole campaign where they essentially say that life is complicated. So they had actually an ad where you see this person who is driving back from work, and he looks up his GPS system, and the GPS says your expected arrival time is Thursday, which was like 2 days away, and so on. Which obviously they were exaggerating it, but the idea was to say that look, life is so complex all the time. You're dealing with traffic and so on. Mealtime shouldn't be. And
Hmm.
then they make a plug for their prepared meals, which is, life is difficult, but mealtime shouldn't be. And then you have their prepared meals. Now, mind you, what they're talking about making life simpler here is they're not necessarily saying that take my prepared meal and put it for 2 seconds in the microwave and it's ready to eat. It's not that ease that they're talking about. What they're talking about is the ease of choice, because choice, when we start thinking about choice, it can be very stressful when we have to make decisions.
Sure.
So they're saying, take that decision, make that decision making around, you've already had a tough day, make the decisions around your mealtime at least easy, which is because otherwise, if you were going to make your own meal, you'd be thinking about, hey, should I eat healthy? Should I eat carbs? Should I do this? Should I eat, greens? Should I do, there's like a million choices to be made
Yeah.
if you're going to make your own meal. But with this, all those choices become very simplified because you have your pick of all kinds of prepared meals that they sell in their stores. So lowering that burden of choice is what the Occam's razor is about. And here it's a marketer that is very cleverly doing that. Now, mind you, are there prepared meals? Let's go back to the point you made. Are there prepared meals that much better than, let's say, the prepared meals you might get at a Dominick's or a Jewel Osco or say, or an Albertsons? Maybe not, right? But nonetheless, this campaign really taps into the idea that mealtime shouldn't have to be so complicated. So,
Right.
go for it. And then you think of that and you automatically do it because choice can be instinctive. This is just one example, but there are many, many different things like this that give you a sense of how people make choices. And in my book, I talk about 7 different ways that you can make new brands. These types of brands, which sort of tap into your experiential wisdom, I call them brands with wisdom. That's one way to make great brands. But then, of course, there are many other ways that you can do it.
Do you think that in hate to say it this way, but I will, a perfect world, um, it would be better if we made choices instinctively or really analyzed? Or do you think the
Yeah.
analyzation just introduces too much stress?
Well, it's stress. It's a lot of work also. If you're going to analyze everything, it's just not possible to analyze everything, which is the whole idea about learnings, right? Because once you learn something, you want to be able to use that learning as broadly as possible, right? And which is why there's all kinds of there's all kinds of advice from all kinds of sources, from religious sources, from your mother, from your wife, from your friends. You get from experts. You get all kinds of advice because
Mm-hmm.
you want to be able to have certain principles so that you can live life without having to spend a whole day doing spreadsheets around what's a good choice and what's a bad choice. Having said that, there are certain times when you do have to think, when the learnings that are available to you are outside of the experience that you've had previously in life. In those instances, you do have to think. So it's a this is a good balance that we have to arrive. And one of the examples that I mentioned in my book is, let's say you're going out and taking a mortgage for your home, right? Wow, that's a complicated decision.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's a decision where if you make a mistake, that could be very costly. You could find that suddenly you can't afford your mortgage, so it can be pretty complicated. And so that, in fact, would be a good time to bring out a spreadsheet and sit down and maybe sit with a pencil and a piece of paper and write down what the positives and negatives and different mortgage products might be and what have you, and also maybe read the fine print. And what happens though is that most of the time we will make a mixed decision where we will do some instinctive work and
Yeah.
some real analysis. So what you might do is you might say, okay, I got to get a mortgage. Which of my friends have got a mortgage recently? And maybe I go and talk to them about how their experience has been. Maybe I go talk to Michael because financially he's such a smart guy. I'm gonna if he's going for a mortgage with Bank of America, that must be a good place to go. So I'll most likely go with Bank of America because Michael went there. So that is part of what the now that is part of what is drawing into an expert bias, or a part of what is drawing into a herd effect, right? Where people go in a certain direction because they say, hey, everybody else is doing it.
Right.
Or the person that is an expert is doing it, which is why you see so many ads in television where there's some so-called expert who's telling you to do X, Y, and Z. And then you say, you stop to think for yourself and you do it. Now, there are risks with it. But nonetheless, when you're designing brands, we do have to balance, because that can be, in fact, a legitimate strategy where we have certain experts or certain very respected people that are going to make a recommendation or a suggestion of a product, and then people are going to do it.
Well, if
You
you're
do it
if
responsibly. That is a very viable brand strategy that certain brands will take.
sure, and if you're going to go into an analysis mode, um, you need to understand what that means and how to analyze. And for example, you talked about the expert, and well, I'm going to do it because he's doing it, and
Yeah.
there are risks in doing that, and one should really take the time, although I think a lot of people don't,
Yes.
to analyze and look at real facts. Okay, so
Yeah.
he had a great success. What about my other friends over here who bought a house in the last couple of years?
Yes.
And really taking the time to explore it and do it right. If you're going to analyze, really analyze, and don't just look at one person or take one view. It's like you go to a doctor and you get a diagnosis, and then you decide, I really need a second or a third opinion. Do that
Right.
right, because it'll make all the difference in the world.
Yes. Yes, it does. And as you can see, some of these things also come into play, not just in marketing, but right now we're in the middle of campaign season,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a lot of very strategic marketing that's done by in politics, and that's a whole you can write a whole book about
Sure.
that, well, which is the different strategies that politicians may use to get people to decide. Because remember, there's only so many voters that are going to actually sit and do an in-depth analysis of
Right.
different policies that have been put in place by different politicians. What was the economic impact of it? Whether it's immigration policy, whether it's um,
Economic or whatever.
whatever. I mean, to really do the analytics around, did that policy actually work out, and who did it benefit, and so on, is a lot of work. And and most people are not really going to do that. So
They
in
should,
essence,
but they won't. And you're absolutely right.
yes, yes. I mean, and I think they should do it. I would say at least they should do a mix of the two, right? They
Mm.
have to understand, like, hey, what's going on? How do I make some good decision around certain things? But often they may pick on one or two things which align with really their system of beliefs, right? Which is why it's important for uh, politicians find it very important to figure out what your beliefs are and try to align with them, because they know if they can do that, then you will go with that because it's already in your belief system and so on. So
And
I
what
mean,
you,
these things become very important uh, in marketing, in politics, in our relationships with people, in sales. These are very important things that influence our lives in very important ways.
Sure. And I think that when taking the politicians, as you said, they you want to see that they've aligned with your beliefs. But I think the other aspect of that, which goes back to analysis, is are they really aligning with your beliefs or are they just saying it? And the problem
Yes.
is that we are seeing so much today where there are a lot of things being said and most people are just going strictly on emotion and they're not analyzing. And that's doing a disservice to everyone. And it would really be great if people would do more real analysis of all of the politicians on both sides and
Yeah.
look at what's really happened. I was just reading an article this morning about the economy, and the reality is that it said that in fact the most of the naysayers about the economy today come from one party and not the other, and that's happened more often than not over the last many years. In terms of economy, the people are going by the party, and that's real lovely, but is that reality? And the problem is we don't take the time to really look at it.
Yes, and and that is it's just and that's the reality of it, Michael, which is that people's lives are very complicated. There are a lot of things that they're doing, and they have to go to work, they have to cook meals for their kids, they have to pay their
Yep.
mortgage. There's just so many things happen.
Yep.
So realistically speaking, people only give a fraction of their brain capacity to many of these decisions, and which is why, as brand marketers, we have to be very cognizant of the fact that people are going to make these decisions based on their own learnings, their own experiences, and therefore, how do we make sure that we can get some preference from them by understanding what their experiences and what their belief systems are. Now, mind you, you have to do this with a sense of responsibility because, with all of this learning about how people make their decisions comes the opportunity to manipulate people.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want for brands, you don't want your work to be around doing that. You want to be doing things in a responsible way, because that is the right thing to do.
Right. And it's important to do that, um, and to really take the time to do it right. And it is just kind of one of the issues that we face, that a lot of people aren't going to take the time to really analyze or take the time to understand. I'm just too busy to do that. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
and people take advantage of that and do spin things and try to just manipulate. And unfortunately, there's way too much of that going on in so many things that we observe and see today because they're taking advantage of the fact that people are so busy.
Yes, yes. And that's why, in my book, I have a whole chapter, by the way, in the book on ethics. So it's called Branding with Ethics, and it is exactly about that point, which is
Mm-hmm.
with this knowledge and with this learning, because when you read my book, we've talked about maybe two or three things out of the book in terms of how you can influence people, but in the book there are 30 different things that you can learn. So because it's an entire playbook for how you do this well.
Right.
But with that but with that comes that responsibility for every marketer to understand what is the right way to do that, because yeah, you might get some bump in sales, you might make a nice little bonus one year, but ultimately these things are
Yeah.
not the right things to do you
Right.
know so you have to. So in fact, in the book, and let me see if I can remember my own book, there are few things that I talk about three principles that every branding campaign must pass through. So one is this whole idea of that we understand as the canonical principle, which is do unto others as you would they do unto you. So don't do a campaign which you wouldn't want someone doing to you or to your kids or something like that, right? So that's one thing that's a no-no. Second thing that is a no-no is that don't do anything which this actually comes from a philosopher by the name of Immanuel Kant, a very famous German philosopher, Immanuel Kant, who came out with something called the categorical imperative. And really, what he talks about is that don't do anything which, if everyone started doing, that would be a social that would be a social detriment,
Hmm.
right? That would be the detriment of the society. Don't do something that which if everybody else also did would really lead to a deterioration of society. And so that's another principle that is very important. And then the last one is the sunshine principle, which is don't do anything which if people discovered that you had done it, that you would feel embarrassed about it, right? So,
Right.
things that you're willing to talk about, to do things that if they appeared in the front pages of the New York Times that this is what you did, that you wouldn't be embarrassed by it. You would still be proud of what you had done. So with those three things, I find that most marketing dilemmas, most branding dilemmas can in fact be addressed.
Yeah. And that makes perfect sense by any standard. A question that I've been thinking about, you dealt with a lot of pharma companies and so on, and I would suspect that in dealing with a lot of pharmaceutical organizations and so on, you've interviewed a lot of people, probably a lot of people with disabilities and so on. How do you think that the work that you are doing and have done has really benefited or affected them?
Yes, I think that is. I think actually one of the things that I do a lot of work in the pharmaceutical sector actually, and in the healthcare sector generally, but in the pharmaceutical sector for one. And I actually love working in that space. It is, as a marketer, it's where you really feel like you're actually making a big impact, to be honest, because when some pharmaceutical companies these days have come out with some fantastic drugs, which I've personally seen have made a phenomenal difference in people's lives. You can imagine as a marketer, if you will, I have a choice of working for consumer product companies and tell them how to sell a box of cereals in a better way, or I can work with a pharmaceutical company and help them, with get a drug to market, which is really going to have a transforming effect on a person's life. And so, in my calculus, in my equation, that has weighed heavily, which is that when you work with these companies, with the healthcare companies, you're so close to truly appreciating people's lives and how those things can be altered. So a lot of times in the work that I've done, it's been it's been very much about understanding how people that have certain disabilities or certain diseases in certain cases, how their lives are really being impacted, how that disease is robbing something away from them, but understanding it through their lens and seeing how you can actually come in with a conversation. Oftentimes, those are things that don't have anything to do with the drug that you're going to be marketing, but nonetheless, having that total understanding is essential to actually connecting with that person to begin with. Because remember that branding and marketing is a lot about communications.
Hmm.
And unless you can understand how you're going to relate to that person and how you are going to communicate with that person, you're actually not going to you're not going to make progress, and you're not going to be able to get them in a place which is a better place for them.
Hmm.
And so in that sense, it's very important. And I'll give you an example. There was one time I was working with a company called AbbVie, which has one of the most successful drugs called Humira, which is for people with rheumatoid arthritis.
Right.
And in rheumatoid arthritis, it's kind of like a lifelong disease. And before this drug came out, people used to go through a lifetime of suffering, in terms of joint pain, in terms of stiffness in their joints, and so on. And it was just a very difficult situation. There were no good solutions out there. However, when the drug came out, we were finding that even people that could benefit from this drug, that they were not actually taking it because they said, hey, this is a newfangled drug. It's a biologic. Gee, I've been taking, pain pills and it's kind of fine. I've spent the last 20 years in pain and I've kind of managed it, and I'll be fine. I don't need to take this newfangled maybe experimental drug. It wasn't experimental, but nonetheless, that's how people can think about it. I don't want to be
Right.
experimented on.
Right.
And it was kind of like, we really had to understand that mindset, because one time I was doing a focus group, and I was talking to this woman. Her name was Lisa, and she was, talking about her things. And I was telling her, "Hey, Lisa," and this was when I was a young marketer, much less experienced and much less wiser than I am now. I was telling her, "Lisa, hey, look, this is a fantastic drug. I don't understand why you're not taking it, because it's a fantastic drug. Your pain will go away, your stiffness will go away, and you're going to feel a lot better. You'll be able to go get a job. This is just going to change your life. What's going on here?" And she sort of stopped me, and she said, looked at me, and she said, "Look, Sandeep, if you don't understand what I'm going through and what my life is all about, how are you going to help me?" And that was kind of such a, it was a moment that sort of stopped me, because at
Yeah.
that moment, it was kind of very perplexing to me, because remember, as a marketer, you came from that mindset that if I tell you how my product is different and what it does, then you should obviously want it, right? That was the mindset. That was the list branding mindset. But here, what I was being told by this person was that, look, unless I have that connection with you, unless I understand, unless I can trust that you are a person that can relate to what I'm going through, and you understand my life, I'm not going to trust anything that
Right.
you're saying,
Which is
right?
fair.
Which is fair. But as a young marketer at that time, I didn't understand that. And
Sure.
I was kind of, hey, well, why does she care whether I understand her life or not? I've got a drug that's going to change your life. So, but that is, that sort of got me on this journey of understanding what is this consumer psychology, what are these things that are going to help people change their behaviors. And then you get into all these things about wisdom, around beliefs, around values, around empathy, which are all the different ways in which you can design brands which are going to be way more effective, which I then talk about in my book, and with all these different experiences that I have. And of course, I give lots of examples and stories, because remember, we said stories are important. So you need to be able to tell stories so that people can remember what you're saying better. But yeah, that's so it's a book about brands, but it's a book about stories, really.
One of the things that I find being blind, so if you will, that I find as a person with a disability is that we tend not to be included in the conversation.
Yeah,
People make so many assumptions about disabilities, and they start with the basic premise, well, disability means lack of ability. Well, it doesn't, but
yeah,
we don't get included in a lot of the conversations. And so the result is we have things like um, people who are diabetic, um, and who let's use people who are blind and diabetic, or have diabetes. The problem is that the way to deal with measuring insulin and really dealing with measuring blood glucose have been very primitive. And while there is newer technology that allows for more constant monitoring, just recently, the first version that has the potential to be accessible for people who happen to be blind has come on the market and has been approved. And that actually is using an app with a
ah,
constant
the
monitor
voice.
that transmits to the app.
Yeah,
But the reality is there's so many issues and so many types of things where we get left out,
yes,
because the pharmaceutical industry doesn't include it or consider it a high enough priority, or
yes.
it's too expensive. And again, a total lack of understanding or value of what we bring to the marketplace. And how do we deal with changing that?
Yes, I mean, that is such a great example that you're bringing from your personal life. So thank you for sharing that. But I think, in the example that I talked about, it was the same thing that was very apparent, which
Mm-hmm.
is, even when people are, not necessarily, they don't necessarily have a disability, so they're not blind, they're not,
Right.
disabled, but they still get left out of conversations,
Yeah.
right? Because the people that are in a position of power or the marketers are just not listening to everything that they
Right.
should be listening to. They are not sensitive. They talk about being customer centric, but they really are not. And that
Yes.
is because they because and it's and I'll give you an example. Outside of disabilities, I'll give you an example about how people get left out of conversations in many different ways. So there was a campaign that recently and that was done um, by Samsung. Again, a very rich company with the
Hmm.
best marketers in the world, no shortage of resources, and so on. And they were marketing their new watch, like to compete with Apple Watch.
Apple Watch, right.
And they came out with this campaign in which they showed this woman that's running through, decides at 2 in the morning to run through some streets, and she's running through these very sketchy streets, and she's in middle of the night, and so on. And she is, there is another person that is kind of just playing with her, biking around her, and so on. And it was kind of a very sketchy ad, which was put out there. And what happened was when they put this ad out there, they thought it was super cool. The ad agency thought it was super cool because they have very cool graphics. But then again, the person that you're leaving out of that conversation is really the customer.
The
And what
consumer,
happened was
right.
and they put out this ad, and women saw this ad, and they said, "You've got to be kidding." And in
Hmm.
fact, right around the time that this ad came out in Ireland, there was a woman who had, in fact, gone out running at night, and she got attacked, and she got attacked and raped and this and that. And so there was that whole story going. And meanwhile, they come out with this ad, which is almost depicting this kind of a situation, this woman in this, and they're thinking it's pretty cool because of the graphics that they've done. And so you have to be very sensitive to not just what you're saying, but what the other person is actually hearing. And I'm
Yes.
saying hearing in a kind of
Right.
a metaphorically, right? Which is, you have to be able to see things from the eyes, from the ears, from the perspective of the person that is actually getting this message. Otherwise, you are doing what you just said, which is you're leaving them out of the conversation. And I think that is what you just described so eloquently in your own experience.
Right. And it happens so often in so many different ways. We have been doing this about an hour, and I think we're going to have to stop so we don't get people too tired of us. But a couple of
Okay.
things. But a couple of
Yeah.
things. Can we continue this and do another episode in the future?
Oh, of course. Yeah. I'd be happy to talk to you, Michael. This
I
is
think we
this is
should
so
do it.
easy for me. It just kind of flows. So if you're getting what you need out of this, then I'm happy to do this in the
Oh, I
future.
think I think we should. How can people reach out to you and so on if they'd like to?
So there are multiple ways that they can do that. They can go to my blog website, which is simply my name, sandeepdayal.com.
Can you spell that,
Uh,
please?
that is SandeepDayal at sorry, no, I made that mistake. SandeepDayal.com.
.com,
That's
right.
that's what that is. Yes. Or they can go to my company website, Cerenti.com, CERENTI.com. And in both instances, there is a place where they can send messages. And I usually look at those messages personally and respond. I always respond.
Well, cool. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on. And I do want to do another episode. So we have to schedule a time and record it because I know there are lots of other questions and things that we can delve into. So if you don't mind, I think we should do it.
Yeah, we'll do that. Let me just mention to you that I am going to be actually out of the country in February and March, coming back in the middle of April.
Okay.
Um, Either we can do it then, or if you wanted to do it earlier, I mean, I can. I'll be in India, but I can still, I've done lots of webinars from there, so it's not an issue as long as we can work with the time difference.
Well, bottom line is like we did with this one, we'll schedule it at whatever time is convenient for you. So
Okay.
I'll resend the link and you just schedule it for when you want. So if you want to do it when you get back, that's okay. Whatever works for you.
Okay. Yeah, no, I'd love to do it, Michael. So thank you. Thank you again for including me on your podcast.
Well, thank you. And I want to thank you all for listening. We really appreciate it. I hope that you'll give us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening to Unstoppable Mindset. We really value your ratings and we value your input. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can do so by sending me an email at Michael, Michaelhi, at Accessibe, ACCESSIBE.com, Michael H.I. at Accessibe.com, or go to our podcast page, www.michaelhinkson.com/podcast. And Michael Hinkson again is MichaelHinkson.com/podcast. So please do that and Sandeep for you as well as others. If you know of somebody else who we ought to have on as a guest on Unstoppable Mindset, really would appreciate you emailing me or letting me know. We are always looking for more people to have on, although it is fun to talk to somebody more than once like we will do with Sandeep. Well, thank you all for listening. And again, Sandeep, I want to thank you one last time for being here as well.
Thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed this.